Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating biological and psychological timeline to see exactly how your organism protects itself from a chaotic and, let's face it, often threatening world.
We go about our daily lives totally taking for granted the immense, invisible armor that we wear. But before we can even begin to understand our psychological armor, we really have to ask how we process all the overwhelming danger and information around us in the first place. How does the system actually recognize a threat, sound the alarm, and ultimately protect our core sense of self?
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover processing a chaotic world, the body's alarm system, the toll of chronic stress, the mind's psychological shields, and finally, protecting our self-esteem. Let's just dive right in.
Starting with Section 1, Processing a Chaotic World, specifically filtering the noise. We need to begin right at the intake level to understand how our brain acts as the very first shield against environmental overload.
Think about this for a second. Every single moment, humans are bombarded by an astonishing 11 million bits of sensory data. We're talking light, sound, temperature, tactile feedback. It's an absolute flood of information. It's literally like trying to drink from 10,000 fire hoses all at once. But consciously, our brains process only a tiny fraction of that chaos. If we didn't have a built-in way to filter and interpret this massive data dump, we would be completely paralyzed.
So how do we manage this incredible load? We basically rely on two primary methods. First, there's bottom-up processing. This reacts instantly to raw stimuli, like jumping at a sudden loud noise or pulling your hand back from a hot stove. It's entirely sensory-driven and happens in real time based on raw data. But then we have top-down processing. This uses our past experiences, our mental schemas, to quickly fill in the blanks and anticipate outcomes. Like if you're navigating through a thick fog or trying to read a blurry text message, your brain uses what it already knows to actively construct meaning without needing every single piece of raw data. Working together, these two processes are constantly scanning those 11 million bits of data to ask one crucial question: is this a threat?
Which brings us to Section 2, the body's alarm system, or the physical fight-or-flight response. Let's look at what happens when that filtered data is officially interpreted by the brain as a physical threat.
Okay, so your body actually handles these threats with a brilliant dual response system, a fast one and a slow one. At 0 seconds, boom! The threat is detected. Within just 1 second, the fast response activates. This is the sympathetic adrenomedullary system, or the SAM axis. It absolutely floods your system with adrenaline and norepinephrine. Your heart rate spikes, your breathing gets rapid, you are instantly ready to fight or flee. But if that threat sticks around, right around the 10-minute mark, the slow response kicks in. This is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA axis. It releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, which eventually triggers the release of cortisol. And cortisol is exactly what gives your body the prolonged endurance and sustained energy it needs to handle an ongoing crisis.
But that naturally leads us to Section 3, the toll of chronic stress. What happens when the alarm won't turn off? Because this system is incredibly effective for acute dangers, like running from a predator. But what if the threat is a highly stressful job or chronic financial worry? What if our physical shields are forced to stay raised indefinitely? Well, Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome maps out this exact danger. It shows how prolonged exposure to stressors forces the body through 3 distinct stages. Stage 1 is the alarm reaction. That's the initial shock we just talked about. Stage 2 is the resistance stage, where your body desperately tries to adapt to the ongoing stress by keeping those hormones, especially cortisol, elevated. But eventually, if the stressor just won't quit, you inevitably hit Stage 3, the exhaustion stage. This is where your bodily resources are completely tapped out. You're looking at severe burnout, deep fatigue, and a drastically reduced tolerance to any new stress coming your way.
And the fallout from this? It is literally systemic. The damage of chronic stress spans across your entire body because constantly elevated cortisol is ultimately terrible for your organs. Take the cardiovascular system. It causes hypertension and vascular dysfunction. Down in your gut, it decreases motility and damages the mucosal barrier, which is exactly why chronic stress is so often linked to gastrointestinal disorders. Your immune system gets suppressed, meaning you have fewer lymphocytes to fight off infection and wound healing actually slows down. Even your musculoskeletal system takes a hit. Prolonged cortisol exposure can literally lead to muscle wasting and decreased bone density. Basically, if this physical armor is worn for too long, it starts to crush the wearer.
Moving on to Section 4, the mind's psychological shields, unconscious defense mechanisms. Because as we know, not all threats are physical.
When the threat isn't to our physical body, but rather to our mental equilibrium, our sense of self, our mind steps in and deploys its own set of subconscious psychological shields. Drawing on classical psychoanalytic theory, psychiatrist George Vaillant categorized these defense mechanisms into 4 distinct levels of maturity. And it's fascinating because our coping strategies range wildly depending on our psychological state. Level 1 involves pathological defenses, like psychotic denial. This is where a person radically reshapes external reality just to avoid coping with it. Level 2 features immature defenses, which might lessen distress temporarily but are usually pretty socially undesirable. Level 3 includes neurotic defenses. These offer short-term coping but often cause long-term relationship headaches. And finally, Level 4 represents mature defenses. These are conscious processes that we adapt over time to optimize our success in society. Let's actually look a bit closer at a few of these.
First up, let's look at projection, which is a Level 2 immature defense. Projection allows a person to avoid their own undesirable feelings or thoughts by falsely seeing those exact same urges in the actions of the people around them. So, say someone has a deep, unacknowledged hostility. They might constantly accuse their friends or their coworkers of being angry or out to get them. It's essentially a way for the ego to step back and say, hey, I'm not the one feeling this unacceptable way. They are.
Then there's reaction formation, a Level 3 neurotic defense, and this one's a bit wild. This mechanism causes someone to act in the completely opposite manner to their true hidden impulses, and they usually do this in a really exaggerated way. Why? Specifically to forcefully prove, both to themselves and to others, that the unacceptable urge simply does not exist. For example, if someone secretly harbors unacceptable prejudice beliefs, they might counter those hidden feelings with overly exaggerated, highly performative displays of extreme tolerance, just to mask that internal conflict. On the flip side, we have sublimation, which Vaillant firmly places at Level 4. Sublimation is considered highly adaptive and mature because it safely channels anxiety, unacceptable instincts, or raw aggression into culturally productive pursuits. So, instead of acting out aggressively, a person might channel that intense energy into a rigorous contact sport, or they might transform their deep internal angst into creating really powerful art or music. It integrates those conflicting emotions in a way that is genuinely a win-win for the individual and for society.
Let's move into our final section, Section 5, Protecting Our Self-Esteem, and look at the modern evidence for this psychological armor. Because the way we view these psychological shields has evolved significantly over the years. Modern research, spearheaded by revisionists like Fennikel and backed by current social psychology, has totally updated our understanding. Freud originally thought defenses were mostly about hiding, Victorian sexual and aggressive urges. But today's understanding is that these defense mechanisms are primarily deployed to protect our ego. Specifically, they are there to protect our self-esteem and maintain a favorable view of ourselves whenever that view is threatened.
And the modern empirical studies on this are absolutely fascinating, especially regarding reaction formation. Researchers monitored 2 distinct groups with very specific aversions: subjects with high sex guilt viewing erotica and highly homophobic subjects viewing homosexual stimuli. In both cases, the participants verbally reported very low subjective arousal. They said, "Nope, not feeling a thing." However, the physiological instruments measuring their physical responses impartially showed high physiological arousal. This perfectly illustrates that when individuals view their own physical arousal as a threat to their identity or their self-esteem, their mind deploys a defense mechanism, insisting on the exact opposite of what their body is actually experiencing.
Now you might be wondering, why go through all these complex subconscious gymnastics? Why not just repress the thought and forget about it? Well, as research by Wegner and others has clearly shown, repression just fundamentally fails. Forcibly suppressing unwanted thoughts eventually leads to a well-documented rebound effect. Those exact thoughts return, and they return even stronger and more frequently than before. You simply can't just shut things out of the conscious mind long-term. And that is exactly why our minds require these highly complex, unconscious defense mechanisms, like reaction formation or sublimation, to protect our psychological homeostasis and keep our self-esteem intact. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to take a moment and reflect on the armor that you wear every single day. From your brain instantly filtering millions of bits of data, to your SAM and HPA axis managing your physical stress, all the way to your ego projecting and sublimating to protect your self-esteem. Your organism is fighting a daily battle for your survival. But now that you recognize the physiological and psychological ways your body defends itself, how will you choose to adapt to the threats of tomorrow? Are your shields keeping you trapped, or are they actually helping you grow? Definitely something to think about the next time you feel your pulse quicken.